Have you ever seen pictures of the old world, say the 1800s, and just been in awe at the beauty of our cities and our towns and of everything at that time? I mean, if you look at a European city, if you just look up any major European city and then put 1800s after it, you'll see a collection of domes and spires and beautiful stone buildings that sprout forth out of the ground and are just arrayed in these beautiful, intricate patterns. And even the street lamps had these wrought iron features with gargoyles or creatures at the bottom, or they were shaped like trees. And you almost feel, when you look at these things, as someone who lives in the West, like you were robbed of your inheritance. Like, I almost feel indignant whenever I see these things now. I get mad. I'm like, that belongs to me. And I don't get to experience that because it was destroyed. Where is this beautiful classical architecture? It's gone. It still exists in remnants, and some people still build it. But en masse, look at the most recent apartment building built near you. No matter where you are, whether you live in Scotland or France or America, odds are it's built in some horrible, ugly, brutalist style, or one of those weird modern styles where they put like exterior siding in some orange color and then yellow on the next one, and vice versa. And then you have these big oblong rectangular, and then what's it called, the triangles up on the side. Just these, I'm losing my train of thought because I'm so annoyed by this degradation of our rich architectural history. And that's what this really is hanging on. The crux of what I'm trying to say here is history and tradition. Because if you look at when this architecture disappeared, it generally happened after the First and Second World War. And so what I'm here to argue is that although the collapse of Western society was a long and brutal one, it ended with World War I. That is where the West truly fell. And why is that? Well, let's go back to architecture. And let's start with, what is architecture? You could say architecture is just a collection of walls and trusses and beams. It's a science, it's mathematics. It's something functional to keep us safe from the elements. It's shelter. Or you could go one step further and you could say that architecture is the way that we build things. But in the Western sense, architecture is a reflection of our patrimony. It is the continued tradition of our culture through the expression of the physical world. There's a professor of architecture at Notre Dame named Duncan Stroit, and he said that the architecture of churches is the built form of theology. And so when you walk into a church, you're not just looking at something beautiful, you're not just seeing the arches and the paintings and the altar and the Stations of the Cross, but you're seeing theology made material. It's a story. It tells you something about its nature. And that's what architecture is. Because we as a people, especially in the West, value thought. And whenever we create something, it is an expression of that thought. And there have been patterns of thought that have emerged throughout history, but in the West, we've had a great intellectual tradition that has built atop itself with debate and the classical methods of learning, and it really culminated in the 1800s. And there were peaks and there were ups and downs, as anything has, yet that patrimony is almost lost to us now. What we build no longer reflects that beauty of the Western tradition, but it reflects our current culture, as all things do. And what was different about the culture then? Well, for one, the culture was distinctly Christian. The culture, and even though by the 1800s that may have been in decline, through most of Western history, and even if you look at the Romans and the Greeks as an example, virtue was prized above many other things. Even the pagans had these ideas of taming their passions. With a priest told me one time of the example of them holding back their horses from running wild, right? They're pulling in these desires. And if you look at Marcus Aurelius and many other pagan philosophers, and Aristotle and Plato, the way that they understood the world was through virtue. And this reached its pinnacle with Christian thought and the message of Christ and his church. And that really came to shape Western architecture and aesthetics for many years to come. And it also shaped the social hierarchy, because Christ's message is one of love and one of unity. And that led to very communal societies where, and localist as well, where especially during the Middle Ages, but even after that for a long period, people enjoyed a sense of freedom in their localities where they shaped their culture as a part of their broader context of Christendom. And therefore, you have, you are an individual, you have your family, and then you have your town, and then you have your nation, which for a large part of Western society, nation didn't really exist, but you still had a cultural identity with the area you inhabited. And then that goes all the way to the whole of the West, and then the whole of Christendom. But we've lost that. We've completely abandoned that now. And now we really don't have a common sense of, or a common idea of what we value as a society. Now, there are many things that are valued, but to each person, oftentimes it's almost an apathetic stance that everyone takes now, that our culture has shifted to. There is a lack of value now. And this is juxtaposed to this great age of civilization that existed before us. So what happened after the war? Well, post-war modernism really took the spiritual and aesthetic ideas of the world before and completely inverted them. We prioritize speed and abstraction and novelty rather than creating something that's beautiful, that reflects virtue. And this disrupted the continuity of Western aesthetics, Western thought, Western everything, the entirety of civilization. And that's why I would argue that this is the point in which Western civilization truly collapsed at a greater and more consequential time than even the fall of the Roman Empire or the fall of any great empires. The fall of the empires and the nation states or the nation monarchies in Christian Europe after World War I was the greatest collapse of them all, because it has plunged us into a deeper pit than any previous catastrophic event has, at least for Western culture. And there's a cultural historian, his name is Christopher Dawson, and he says that Western culture cannot endure without Christianity. And even apart from that, this idea of virtue and this reflection of an order and an ordered society was completely disrupted after the war. It was dismantled, and it went from not just people had dissident ideas, but everything around you reflected that, and it was all in favor of functionalist or ephemeral ideas. So why did this happen during World War I? Why didn't it happen before? Well, as I said, that it was really the culmination. It was a long process. I'd argue that it most prominently started with the Enlightenment movement and rationalism particularly, because we started to replace our years and years of built knowledge through tradition with pure reason. And reason was a large part of that tradition. Just think of Aristotle. Anything you've ever read by him is immensely predicated on reason. And then Aquinas is famous for really being a synthesizer of reason and faith. And Augustine did it very well before him with Platonic thought, then Aquinas with Aristotelian. But after the war, we really abandoned that. And sorry, not after the war, after the Enlightenment movement, we really began to abandon that in favor of rationalism. And then industrialization came. And industrialization systematized the world. It made everything into a machine. And that really disrupted the communal sense of our societies. And that was a big big blow to this continuity of culture. But the reason that the war was the final straw that broke Western civilization was because of the collapse of the tapestry of the Christian monarchs in Europe. Because whenever they collapsed, tradition and patronage of the arts and this cultural continuity fell with them. And it left a vacuum with chaos all throughout Europe in many places, and ideologies filled that gap, whether it was fascism, communism, or liberal consumerism. The world very greatly shifted away from this idea of a Christian Europe, a Europe built on the backs of the generations that came before, a Europe built on tradition, on the patrimony of Europe. And I think Pope Benedict XV said it best when he was speaking about the World War. He said, "This war is the suicide of civilized Europe." And I would agree with him. Europe is not the same as it used to be. That patrimony is no longer evident in the day-to-day culture and society, nor is it reflected in the modern architecture and the things that are built. And after the war, and before the war for a long time, but after the war, whenever these Christian institutions were put out of power in favor of more secular ones, philosophy was reduced to rationality. Industry reduced man to a machine. And these ideologies replaced tradition with an idea of control. And they wanted to build and take power out of the chaos. And the end of World War I was a uniquely distinct period in which this chaos was so prevalent and so easy for these ideologies to root into and tear apart society, because the war tore it apart. And then in the chaos, these ideologies just seeped in, planted their seeds, and what has resulted, it sprouted the destruction of our heritage as the West. So what can we even do about this? Well, I think the first thing that's important to know is that, and I'm young, I'm only 19, so I haven't done much, but I have been looking into a lot of the ways that I can help, and I think we do need to form some sort of political movement, and I think a lot of them exist now, but I think we need to research politics, and we need to research how to use our vote, and what does that mean. But I'm not a political scientist, so I'll leave that to more qualified people. What else can we do? Well, I think if we do gain any sort of political power, we need to remember that it's not just the ideology that makes the West, but it's the tradition and that outward reflection. That the patronage of the arts isn't just something that aristocrats do. It's something that builds our culture. It's not a tax write-off. It's a cultural enrichment project. And we need to remember that. Because whenever you walk out in the street and you see something beautiful, for instance, in most places, the churches are the only beautiful things left. And when you walk into your local church, especially if it's beautiful architecture, beautiful Catholic church, and you walk in and you see the great arches and you see the Stations of the Cross and you see Christ at the center, crucified as an embodiment of pure virtue, that inspires you to do something. And that creates real change. So I think drawing people to those landmarks and hallmarks of Western civilization, and then if we are able to gain power once that happens, building that back up. I mean, look at Budapest. They've rebuilt many of their hideous modern facades into beautiful staples of their heritage with classical architecture. And so let's do that in America. We have a beautiful tradition of classical architecture and Gothic. Even Protestant churches, look at the National Cathedral. And so let's build that American tradition, the American Victorian style that, even though Victorian obviously makes you think of England, America had a very distinct take on that. And our four square homes, even things like that in many of our courthouses. Let's build that back. But also in your daily life, let's make things a little more beautiful. And I know for guys, a lot of times we just want it to be like sleek and we want it to be functionalist. But I think it's important to have something that, inspires you. So whether it's as simple as changing your phone back screen to some beautiful architecture, or some great painting of Western society, or even doing all that stuff where you change the widgets and everything to look nice on the phone, since we use our phones so much. Or it's just getting a bookshelf and put it in there. You can order prints on fabric. They call them tapestries, even though that's not what they are, of beautiful works of art and of actual tapestries for like $15 on Amazon. Not that I want to promote vast consumerism. I am a localist, but sometimes we gotta bite the bullet to make the place beautiful, right? The boys have to have beautiful aesthetics around us, and the girls too. So I think it's important that we actually build that up around us. And so I always try that. Now, everything I make looks weird, all the places I decorate, but I do try to maintain that classical air, and I want to look and I want to see. I have Europe right behind me, even as an American, so I want to be able to see my culture reflected in the spaces around us. And I think we should, go make a bunch of money, become influential, and let's try and make these changes, right? But let's not forget patronage of the arts. So go to your local art museum, go look at some art, read books, and that's why I think that World War I was the end of Western civilization. But I think it can come back, and there's so much potential, especially here in America. So God bless, and thank you for watching.